Dina, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to chat with you.
Elena, thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be here.
Before we start recording, I was just remember I was like I followed you for a long time now, for like months. I think it's been like a year, and a mutual contact of ours has recommended me to like bring you on a podcast and have a chat. And I was like, and one day it just clicked, and I was like, I'm glad we're here because I was like, I've been following you and following. I was like, I really like your content. I'm excited for my audience to hear about just kind of who you are and what you're doing and stuff like that. So give us a little bit of a snapshot of kind of your career and where you are today.
Yeah, it's such an honor to be with you. I love what your podcast is about, and it's such an honor to be invited. So thank you. Um, I was saying just before we hit record that I am very much in the shift. I actually have spent 20 years in my career in international development, most specifically and most recently for the past 15 as a gender and social inclusion advisor. So I've worked for consulting firms and nonprofits. I've worked overseas in East Africa for several years, and I've traveled all around the globe in 30 countries, speaking to hundreds of people, mainly women and girls, about issues of gender equality, social inclusion, empowerment, in such a range of sectors. And so in the international development field, I was advising projects and teams on how to address issues that were related to gender equity and social inclusion, and looking to integrate these considerations more meaningfully into the work of international development programming. I loved it. It was fascinating, fast paced, dynamic, and working with practitioners that were super committed. Many people who go into international development want to make the world a little bit better, support, important programming. And I loved that work. But when right before the pandemic hit, I was craving something more. I wasn't quite sure what that more was, but I was thinking more impact, something that was allowing me to be a little more creative, because I felt like my career in international development was getting, and I hate to use this word, but a bit mundane. I was like really wanting to shake something up. And so I was really always drawn to the world of personal development and coaching. And I thought, is there some sort of intersection between international development and coaching that somehow I could blend my two passions? And that's what I've been doing. I created Enough Labs, which is a coaching and consulting practice back in 2020. And I had big dreams, Elena, for it, like such big dreams. And then the world shut down. And I was busy working on my dream, my passion, I hate to call it even a passion project, because when you're a small business owner, you have such pride in what you're building. So this was my dream. And I created Enough Labs and a coaching and consulting practice specifically because I wanted there to be a space for a global conversation on enoughness, really looking to support women and girls around the world to embrace the fundamental belief that they are enough at their core, that we don't need to constantly seek validation, approval, acknowledgement in all of the ways that we tend to reinforce this belief that, oh, if I am able to achieve this, to get this, to have the right relationship, the right job, the right house, the right fill in the blank, then I will be good enough. And a lot of times I'm in conversations with women and girls around this issue that intersects with how confident they feel, how they see themselves. And so I'm really on a mission to design programming and offerings that bring forth this conversation with women and girls around the world through coaching and also dynamic opportunities through consulting. So I shared with you, I'm just a week out from my retirement from international development and plunging full on into entrepreneurship.
Yeah, that's amazing. There's so much to unpack there. I have so many questions. Let
Yeah.
me start with some. But I find it fascinating that and I'm a huge believer in like when is the time, like when the time is right, like the alignment of it. So
Mhm.
and it's interesting because when you started in it, the world kind of stopped, and now is so it kind of delayed you by a couple of years, but it probably prepared you even more.
Yes.
So I always find that interesting, those stories of how people get started, and and it's always like you always started before you actually go full on. So, and I love that because a lot of times when we think about entrepreneurship, it's like, oh well, I just start today and that's it. No, like there's a lot of pre-work that sometimes it takes years, and doing like on the side and kind of trying all these different things before you're like, okay, you know what, now is the time. Like there was a reason for this delay or whatever, if
Yeah.
that's what one believes. So that's really, really interesting, and I can only imagine how interesting the world of international development has been. I want to ask you a couple of questions about that because I think that from your experience, you probably gained a whole lot of just knowledge traveling the world and having these conversations. What has been your biggest, I would say, surprises that you found in your work? Having these, particularly if we're talking about, gender equality and the conversation you have in girls and women around the world, what have you seen as a common theme and the biggest surprises, whether they're good or bad, whether they were disappointing or exhilarating? I'm just
Yeah.
curious.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like I was in such a unique position because, as I mentioned, I was able to travel to over 30 countries around the world, and I was interviewing women and girls and also different members of other marginalized populations about what were their primary barriers, what were the main challenges that they were facing. And I was interviewing people when it came to different sectors. It was agriculture, it was livestock, it was climate change, it was governance, it was peace and conflict resolution. And what I was finding was that there was a very similar story in terms of the barriers. And those barriers had a lot to do with access and participation. And a lot of the barriers that particularly women and girls would talk about were the cultural barriers, the norms in which presented what was appropriate for women to participate in. So a lot of times the norms that would preclude women from taking on leadership roles, whether they were visible barriers or invisible barriers, they were very much present. And it's one of those things that sometimes it feels almost omnipresent of what's appropriate for me in terms of participating in a community meeting or in a specific elected role. Whatever the sector was, there was always a bit of reticence from women saying, well, I would love to, but this context doesn't always allow for that. So what was surprising, I think, because of that common barrier when it came to how appropriate and how it was received in participating, that I saw a lot of women who were dynamic change makers kind of striking out on their own. And a lot of times there was the opportunity to create their own organizations or strike out and do things a little bit differently within that sphere, because it was all about creating their own path. Now, it's not to say that every single context women were unequivocally not given permission or allowed to participate. It's just that there were certain roadblocks. And so even in some countries where it didn't feel like there was so much pressure or that conservative leaning attitude to not create the space for women's leadership, but I think there was also sort of the pressure where even if it was widely accepted, it was the feeling of needing to juggle all of the things. I remember my experience in Kosovo, which was a country that had a lot of advancement for women and a lot of professional development opportunities, but I was in a room with over 40 women who were basically mid to senior level in their career in the energy sector. And there was still that struggle with needing to sort of juggle it all and do it all and not having access to information, wanting to get ahead, wanting to move along further and faster, but that there were certain very real challenges where it sometimes just didn't physically feel possible. So just having the same conversation about juggling motherhood and their career and their relationships with their spouses and the extended family. So there was just a lot of similar conversations happening. I would say that was the biggest surprise, but also really affirming that the conversations that we're having in the workplace amongst women are so similar across the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I find that interesting. I've spent some time in the Middle East, as I've mentioned right before we start recording,
Yep.
and I've traveled quite extensively to a big part of the Middle East, and what I think, and I see these headlines and or women can do this now, or women can do that, and I'm like, and that's great, and that's progress, and I love it. But it
Yeah.
just comes down to those other roadblocks, which is the cultural thing, and
Right.
it's the family dynamic, and
Yep.
even if you have a supportive husband, for example, he still feels a little, if he's in that environment where it's just not the norm for the wife to be a certain way, if she's a little bit too outgoing or whatever, maybe even if the husband accepts that, it's still the cultural pressure it creates a roadblock from so many ways. So I can definitely see, and we see this all over the world. I'm originally from Russia. I grew up in a very patriarchal society. I think we're more patriarchal over there than they are in the Middle East. I mean, frankly speaking. So at least when I was growing up. So it's, but yeah, I think there's something to say about just these invisible roadblocks that, you know, if you just read the headlines, you're like, oh, this is great. But really,
Right.
there's just so much to unpack there. And it's generational too.
There's a deeper story, and I'm so glad you say that it's generational too, because I'm looking at the generation that's coming up now and the way that they're looking at opportunities and, you know, ways in which that they are looking at career options and carving out their own path. And it's very different than the conversation I think that my peers were, and, you know, that we were having early on in our career and as we went on. So I, you know, I appreciate that. It's not just cultural and a black and white issue. It really
Mhm.
is generational and how things are changing and very much in real time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And what has been the biggest what have you learned about yourself through these conversations? Because I can imagine, because that's what happens when we travel in general, and then if you're in that specific environment, I'm sure there's a lot of self-reflection that happens.
Yeah. I would have to say that some of the, I mean, I felt like I was never not learning. I made it a point in every project and every country that I would travel to that I felt like I was the student and I was there to speak to people to hear about their experience and their perspectives. What frustrated me oftentimes in different circles within the international development sector was that you couldn't put together a proposal in Washington, D.C., and understand what these specific communities need.
Mm.
I felt really strongly about that. And it not only grew stronger as more time went on, is that I think it's so important to actually embed the time and get that research in to understand what are some of the key priorities, the key barriers that are affecting these communities and specific segments of these communities in a very real way. Because I think when it comes to the massive amount of donor funding that's available, you want to get it right. And you want to be designing interventions that are specifically tailored to the context in which we're working. And I
Mm.
think what I would learn from people is, you know, what mattered to them was having an impact in their income so that that could really drive the needle in terms of decision making and opportunity and opening up pathways for access for their family.
Mm.
You know, a lot of times implementing partners would design interventions that just weren't matched with priorities. You know,
Mm.
oh, well, we should design workshops that are targeting awareness of this particular issue. But when someone really is interested in how do I get more money for my family so that I can, you know, make certain decisions that are in their vested interest, I just think the mismatch of offerings is it can be problematic. So I think
Mm.
really understanding what communities are in need of, and how the scope of that project has always been really important to me. And I think just as women, particularly, people don't always stop to ask what women want.
Mhm.
What do women need, and what are their priorities? Because I think there is sort of this unspoken assumption that people know if there is a problem in a particular sector, oh, then it must apply to the whole population. But what we're not asking the question of is how are women participating? What kinds of access to information do they have? When you're talking about a livestock project, we're talking about men who are dealing with one particular, you know, breed of animal, and women don't even get involved in that particular
Mhm.
sector. So the issues are going to be totally different. I think
Mm.
taking the time to survey and ask is just so necessary.
Yeah. No, I think that's spot on, and you're right. I mean, but and then also there's of course I think we focus a lot on what women kind of how to say like those women that want to want to provide that, but then there's also a lot of women who just want to be stay-at-home mom and housewives, and I think that's also equally important to kind of distinguish. Again, it's just a choice. Like as long I
Right.
think it's just having that choice and having that access, and then it's your decision. But then that brings up the other side, which is then even if we are given the choice, sometimes we're our own worst blockers,
Mhm.
right? And this, and I'm in tech, and I've there's just so many examples of whether when I was in the Middle East or here, and in particular sectors like tech or very kind of business environments, I'm either the only woman, literally, or one of just a handful, and then it's like you have to, I have to continuously, at least personally, I went through this whole notion of, okay, do I try to be serious? What do I wear? How do I act? Or do I just say screw it and just be myself? And now I'm at a point, I'm like, you know what? I'm a woman. I'm a woman. I'm going to be myself. I'm going to, I'm going to be my feminine self. I'm going to be my strong self, etc. I don't try to adjust anymore. I just show up as I am. But I think it takes a long time to get there. And because it's not always, and you feel it. Oh, you feel it when you're a woman and there's just a bunch of gray and black suits around you. And you almost feel that exclusion, and you do have to work a little bit harder to be in those circles. So what do you think about that? Just like our own perceptions, I guess.
Our own perceptions. I mean, it's such an incredible time to be a woman. And it just the massive amount of choice that you have. But I think it would be unfair to say that women are still not facing certain visible and invisible barriers, particularly those women who are working in male dominated sectors that are still traditionally male dominated and are not necessarily as welcoming to women. And tech is one of those fields. I mean, being able to see other women in those roles. I mean, I think that's where when there's a shortage of women in roles within certain male dominated sectors, it's not as welcoming to bring in more women. And then you end up being that minority inside. And so you're fighting sort of a silent battle that not everyone understands. I think it takes tremendous courage to show up in whether it be a work environment or if you're pursuing an entrepreneurial path, of just really showing up as yourself. Because I think a lot of times, unfortunately, and I'm going to lean a little bit more on my coaching side, is that I think universally and globally, the world is telling women that there's always something that needs to be fixed with them. There's always something that needs to be improved, that they need to be trying a little bit harder or showing up a little bit more in some capacity. It takes so much courage to really own who you are, the capabilities that you bring, the confidence that you can leverage inside of the work that you do, that it really just, it requires you to dig deep. And I think a lot of times women, I don't know, Elaine, if you agree, but it sort of takes the arc of experience to really get to that point. I think back to who I was and how I showed up at like 24, and in comparison to how I'm showing up today, I mean, vastly different. And I talk to women a lot of times who are a little bit younger than me, who are still afraid to say no, are still afraid to push back. And, here they are working until 8 or 9 o'clock because they feel, well, I need to do this because I need to get ahead. And not only do I need to get ahead, but I want to come across as a team player. I don't want to be difficult. I don't want to have this, belief or perspective placed on me from others. So I think there's just so much that we're navigating as women in the workplace, that I think those who can really tap into what they bring and really own that confidently, oftentimes have the opportunity to navigate things a little bit differently than those who are sort of still stuck in the questioning.
Yeah, I think you're so spot on. And honestly, like I don't know how this current generation is dealing with everything that's thrown in their faces. Like subconsciously, we just pick up so many messages, like you're saying. Like it's just, there's always like, oh, there, you can do this, and it's like this image of what a woman should be changes every day, and you're like, so I'm just so confused, right? So I'm so glad I didn't grow up in a generation where internet was the it thing. It came like when I was in high school. You know, so that's super, because I mean I would have been a wreck, honestly. I wouldn't have. I'm very sensitive. I'm an empath. I would have been a wreck. I have my insecurities. I've struggled with body image most of my life up until recent years. I don't know how people do it. It's insane. So it's a very important time to be having these conversations.
I think what's interesting, I'm not sure, I think we're maybe around the same age, came of age in the same generation. I think even without the internet, people that were growing up in our generation were exposed to so many different forms of messaging. Even though we didn't have the internet and we weren't scrolling on social media, I think that there was a very palpable focus on womanhood looking a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
in when it comes to body image, when it comes to how much you could show up and share of yourself, and what was deemed appropriate and what wasn't. So I feel like this conversation, when I talk about what types of messages we've received and how we've internalized that, is really no different than, say, a country in sub-Saharan Africa or
Mm-hmm.
in the Middle East or even in Asia, because they've also been internalizing messages without the help of social media or anything like that, but
True.
compound social media on top of it. So there's a lot of layers to what women are internalizing about the experience, and sort of what's right, what's wrong, what's appropriate. And at the end of the day, I think what we need to be talking about more is that we have agency over giving ourselves the permission of how we get to show up, that it doesn't have to fit a cookie cutter mold, that we can actually start to design this in a way that feels right and true for us.
Mm. Can I be real with you?
Please.
You know what I see still, like I've gone again to numerous events where it was, women in business and women
Hmm.
in this, and it was meant to kind of help other women, right? Like different mentorship schemes for women and etc. And what I've seen, and not just myself, but even so many people I've talked to, is that men tend to still be, in many cases, bigger supporters and better supporters than other women. I don't know if you've experienced that, but I think that as women, we have this, and I don't know again if it's like a thing, that we have this competitiveness to us that is really weird. Not everybody, but I still, in my personal career, in my professional career, I mean, I've had great female mentors, but I've had a lot more support from men in terms of pushing me to opportunities and certain things. And I've seen women speak on panels and events and keynotes about supporting women, and then off stage they're a different person. So I don't know. That's how I feel. So it's like, I try to be the woman that practices, and I try to do my part to not be that woman, but I still see that very often. I don't know what's been your experience. You probably talk to a lot more women than I do, but.
I mean, I have personally experienced this from supervisors that I've had, in conversations that I've been exposed to, in conferences that I've attended. I absolutely have seen that. I also don't like to generalize, right? That, men will tend to be better supporters of women, and we have this competitive streak that is separating us and dividing us more than bringing us together. I think it's present, and I think it would be unfair, and slightly naive to suggest that this isn't the case. I also think back to why there tends to be that streak of comparison
Mm,
and competitiveness, um, present amongst women. And I think generationally, there's certain things that have occurred where women have had to fight for visibility inside of roles, inside of leadership, and that process hasn't been easy. I
mm,
think there's also, if we go even further back into how girls are socialized
yeah.
and what the expectations are. And I think one of the biggest things, there's an amazing TED talk on this, on perfectionism, amongst girls. And I think the implicit focus to always be perfect, to always be on, to always have it together, also contributes to that culture. And I think not allowing the grace to not be sure of how to get to a certain, you know place, or understand how to do certain things, I think creates that shrouded secrecy that is present in a lot of
Mm,
workplace dynamics, and that team culture sometimes. um I think the workplace would look incredibly different if we didn't have this constant sort of surge of comparison and competitiveness, and really looked at it through a lens of collaboration. If we didn't see other women, if certain examples, like in certain contexts, if women weren't seen as a threat and really seen as, I have an opportunity to amplify what she's done without it being perceived as a threat to me, I
mm,
think takes a lot of personal reflection,
mm-hmm,
because I think that there's that deep wound of insecurity that
Hmm.
is present. And I think if any woman sees another woman as a threat, whether it be someone who she's supervising or someone who's above her or someone on her equal level, there's something happening personally, that there's a deep rooted level of insecurity that's present,
Yeah.
and that she is feeling like there's got to be something that needs to be sort of overcompensated for. I think
Hmm.
that honest conversation isn't always present in the workplace. And I'm personally on a mission to try to debunk these, unspoken things. And I think that if we were able to be a bit more honest about what's occurring, we might be able to break down these barriers a bit more and not have um, situations of conflict and competition in the workplace. It
Yeah.
maybe sounds a bit naive. I just think that if the workplace actually created space for more authentic, empathic leadership, that we wouldn't we wouldn't be trying to navigate these situations and issues on our own, that we could actually come together as a team and try to work it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you're spot on. That's very interesting perspective. Yeah, no, you're right. And I think just in general, whether men and women, and anytime you feel threatened by somebody or something, it's really an internal thing
Hmm.
versus external. So
Right.
because I don't like I always like joke and I say nobody really cares about us that much for them to think
Yeah.
about to do something against us. It's usually just their own thing. Like we're not that important in other people's lives by any means, unless there's some history there or something. But 99% of the time, they're not doing it because of you. It's an internal thing. So I think that's a great reminder on
Right.
that point. Yeah, no, I think leadership wise, and we see this changing as well. And I think that there's a lot more, women leaders coming up, and also just with everything that has happened the last few years, I think just leaders in general starting to realize that they need to just be a little bit more vulnerable, a little bit more empathetic. New generations are forcing them to have certain conversations, forcing them to have certain things embedded in company cultures. Otherwise, people just don't stay. They're like, I can't be a part of a leadership style like this.
Right.
Does not align with their values. So I think that's spot on. But let's shift gears a little bit, and I'm curious. I feel like we can go down rabbit hole real quick
Yeah.
on that one, but I'm curious, like, what are you most excited about now that you've kind of, do you feel a little nervous? I didn't sleep for like a month before jumping into business back in 2019. So I'm just curious, like, how, what are you excited about in this year?
Yeah. Well, I made the decision in a way that makes sense for my personality. So, going back last year, I actually made the decision to take a leave of absence from September to November. And I just really needed a moment to kind of quiet my mind and really just get centered around the idea, was this something I really wanted to jump in full time with? And so I gave myself the space, I took a leave of absence without pay and just really allowed myself to be with all of the decisions that needed to be worked out. And I think just giving yourself permission to take space with a major decision like this, like it gave me comfort to say, I knew that if at the end of the 2 months, I didn't want to move forward with this, I could return back to my career full time. But
Mm,
after having 2 months and being able to try out different things in my business, and certain things occurred that I wasn't even expecting, I said to myself, I'm ready. And I made the
mm,
decision to go into entrepreneurship full time, and gave, my company a full, the organization I was working with, a proper transition period of like 6 to 8 weeks. And I think the last 6 to 8 weeks in the role was probably the hardest, because I wasn't ready and thinking about all of the feelings that would come with this shift.
mm,
Um, I cannot tell you, Elena, how many people I asked who have been in entrepreneurship full time, and asked them, you know, what's what are the steps that you need to take to make sure that you're absolutely ready? The magic question of how much money do you think you should have in your account before you really make this work? I've heard so many different answers. There's not a single answer. And there wasn't a single person who could tell me this is how you do it, which
mm,
was proof positive to me that no one's going to be able to tell me how I, Dina, will be able to step into entrepreneurship, because everyone's journey is totally different. And entrepreneurship is one of those weird cliffhanger situations where nothing is really guaranteed. I think it's directly proportionate to how prepared you are, how bad you want it, and what's your tolerance for risk? I think that's another thing amongst women, oftentimes, and a lot of female entrepreneurs I've been talking to, is that we're not always conditioned to be able to deal with risk and uncertainty. I think if we were to say and look at certain studies, that men and boys are oftentimes exposed to and oftentimes encouraged a little bit more to take on risk, where women may be, again, not to generalize, but we tend to be a little more practical. We want to see, certain things that weigh into the decision to feel at ease. But what entrepreneurship has shown me is that there's no foreshadowing. There's no way to tell how this first year in full-time entrepreneurship is going to go for me. But honestly, I'm excited. And I'm excited for a lot of reasons, but one of the primary reasons that stands out for me is that I've worked in a lot of different companies, and I've loved working with different colleagues from around the world. But really, when it comes to leadership, I think there's a lot of times where I've been looking for leaders to do a little bit more, to show up in a more meaningful way, in a way that really was more responsive to the needs of the team. And I'm excited to actually step in and be that type of leader. To really build the culture at a company that I'm building in a way that makes sense and aligns with my values, and to bring in people who are a part of that vision, who are aligned with it. Because that hasn't always been the case. And it's been, frankly, at times, a little disappointing to see leaders miss the mark so directly sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a roller coaster for sure,
It
but it's
is.
an exciting one.
Yes.
And yeah, you're never ready for it, by the way. Everybody, like, you're just not. You can have all, like, you can prepare in so many ways. If even if you financially prepared, something else is gonna go. There's no right way to do it. You just try a whole bunch of different things and see what sticks, and that's how you do it.
And if you could see the Excel sheets on my computer, I mean, it's just all of the scenarios, all of the projections. Nothing has gone the way I thought it would.
Listen, no, it's just having the support network helps, like having a network, that's where it's at,
Yeah,
so
for sure.
that's awesome. So to that point, before I ask you my last couple of questions, where can people find you, where they can follow your journey, where they can get in touch if they're listening and they're like, oh, we need this in our company, we need a Dina?
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. So my website's probably the first place that anyone wants to go. It's www.enoughness.com. And I have a lot of information on a program that I offer to companies called the Leadership Lab. And it's all about supporting women's leadership from within and looking at the leadership journey. And so it talks about the intersections of leadership and confidence and empathy and building trust, both within yourselves, but also within your team. And really looking at this through an intersectional lens focused on equity and inclusion when it comes to outcomes. So I'm really excited about that program that I've designed, and I am in the process of rolling it out to different companies who are really ready to take a massive swing in 2023 at women's leadership and really supporting it in a dynamic and new way. But I also share a lot of my thoughts and stories and perspectives on LinkedIn and on Instagram at Enough Labs.
Sounds good. And I'm going to make sure to share it in the
Yeah.
show notes as well.
Thank you.
So last two questions. First one is, what is one question you wish people would ask themselves more often?
I think one of the most important questions that anyone, not just women, but anyone should be asking themselves is, what makes me happy? I think a lot of times when we're talking about our careers, we often make decisions based off of what we think we should be doing and what makes other people proud or impressed. And I think a lot of times I've met people who, if they had asked themselves what makes them happy, they might be in a different career. They might be in a different place in life. And it's never too late. Like you said, it's always aligned timing. But I think we need to be asking ourselves way more, especially given what's transpired in the world over the last couple of years. What makes you happy?
That's a good one. That's a difficult one. That's a scary one for people to answer, because sometimes it requires shifts all over the place in order to make that happen. So
absolutely.
But it's a powerful one. It's everything.
Yes,
I agree.
I agree.
Good stuff. And the last one is, if you had a magic wand to change anything in the world, what would that be?
I mean, it's pretty obvious with how this conversation has gone. I would say gender equality. True gender equality of what it looks like in terms of access and participation, and shifting antiquated norms that are holding women and other marginalized groups behind.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Dina, thank you so much. I look
Thank
forward
you,
to,
Elena.
look forward to just following your journey. If anything I can do is support, if my audience hears this and they're also, if there's a way anybody, wants to get in touch with Dina and just, continue to make this world a better place.
Please
I think
do.
we can all benefit from that. So thank you
Thank
so much.
you. Thank you, Elena, so much.